Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. On May 21st, voters in Eugene, Oregon will decide whether or not to replace the existing electoral system with star voting for mayor and city council elections. If approved, the city would become the first in the world to utilize the system for electing their political leaders. Today, I'm joined by Eugene-based KLCC reporter Nathan Wilk, who's been covering the ballot measure and the run-up to the vote. Nathan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
Yeah, great to have you. So, Nathan, being the first in the world at anything is a pretty big deal. How did Eugene Measure 20-349 get on the ballot in the first place?
For sure. So star voting was a concept that was invented here in Lane County, and it's been used in some select cases across Oregon. The Independent Party of Oregon's primary for 2020. Last June, petitioners went out into the Eugene community and began collecting signatures to get this on the ballot. They were boosted by a $50,000 campaign contribution from a software engineer who supported the idea. And within a few months, they were able to collect enough signatures to get this on the ballot. Since then, they have been working to try to promote and educate the voting public about this system.
Has star voting ever really been utilized in the U.S. before?
Not really. In some select test cases. So the Oregon Democratic Party used it to elect delegates, so a pretty small scale role of the political activities that they do. At the Independent Party of Oregon, which is a centrist party here in Oregon, used it for a primary as a test case. They have not used it since, although when I spoke to advocates, or rather spoke to members of that party, Sal Peralta with the Independent Party, he said they were open to using it again, possibly in the future.
And then what else can you tell us about the organization behind the drive for Eugene to adopt star voting? I know you mentioned a few details there, but what is their motivation? What are they hoping the new voting system could achieve if it is adopted?
Right. So I've spoken a lot with Sarah Wolk. The Equal Vote Coalition is the organization, and Sarah Wolk is the co-founder there. And really, they want a replacement to the current system, identifying issues that are common in these discussions around alternative voting systems. So that's things like eliminating spoiler candidates. They say star voting would eliminate political polarization in office because it would support candidates who could draw stars from many sides across the aisle. And in addition, they say that it would get rid of the fear of spoiler candidates that sometimes exists in our current voting system, where someone feels like they can't support a candidate because there are three candidates in the race and they have to go with the front runner who better aligns with their interests.
I got you. That makes sense. And some of these election systems can get really bogged down by wonky political definitions and explanations. But let's say you're trying to explain how star voting works to somebody who's voting for the first time. How would you go about explaining how it works and, all that stuff?
Right. So the first thing I would say is that this is not ranked choice voting. That is a very common mistake. In ranked choice voting, your candidates are being eliminated, but you're supporting one single candidate at a time. In star voting, you can be supporting multiple candidates at the same time. So it starts with the first round. You get a scorecard with with 5 stars, and you can rate from 0 to 5. According to the ballot instructions, you're supposed to give 5 stars to your favorite candidate, 0 stars to your least favorite candidate, and you can also give out ties if you want. And so that is the first round. Then all of those scores are tallied up, and the two candidates who got the highest number of stars move on to a second round, which is called an automatic runoff. And so at that point, the system functions a little more like the current system that we're used to. every ballot is looked at again. It's checked again, and the scores that you gave each candidate are compared. So if I gave you, Frank, 5 stars and you made it to that second round, and I gave myself 3 stars, then because I had given you 5, I would have shown that preference, and then that single vote goes to a count. So
Okay.
I have 1 vote in that second round. Now the important key point here is that if I had given 2 candidates the same number of stars, given them both 0 stars, given them both 5, given them both 3, and we went to that automatic runoff, then my vote would be looked at as a vote of no preference. So I didn't care which candidate made it to office, and so my vote essentially wouldn't do anything in that second round. And so
Okay.
those singular votes from each voter would be taken, and then whoever got the majority over 50% would be elected to office. Does that make sense?
No, that was a great explanation. I appreciate the generosity too there, Nathan. I would give you 5 stars as well. But something that confused me a little bit in learning about star voting just before we talked was the rounds. So it's not like people are going back to the polls to vote again, right? That's automatically done, right?
Right. Yes, and that actually creates a very interesting caveat with the system, is that you have to be thinking about both rounds when
Okay.
you're making your tallies. And so, if you decide that you really want your one candidate to win and you don't want to give your second place candidate any stars, if you get to the automatic runoff and you've given your second place candidate 0 stars, and then Darth Vader 0 stars, then the system is going to go, well, you didn't show a preference, and so
I
your vote
understand.
wouldn't count in that second round. Yeah.
I got you. And is that, from what you've heard from folks on the ground, I feel like, people, the advocates for either ranked choice voting or star voting would be probably pretty disappointed that their 2 election systems are getting confused. But what are you
Mhm.
hearing on the ground from folks in Eugene? Do people generally seem split on whether or not this is a good idea, or does it seem like the outcome is a little bit less certain on that?
I mean, I think the thing about star voting is it is hard to picture what effect this would actually have on races, particularly when you get to those possibilities, although they're not super common in Eugene, just in terms of the number of candidates that are running for a seat in office. Think about the possibility of a race with 5 people,
Mhm.
where your stars go, how that would affect who makes it to the runoff, how that would affect the preferences there. I mean, that is a hard thing to picture. And so I think, the complexity of it is something that can be very daunting when I speak to people about trying to make a decision about whether this is a good or bad idea for Eugene elections, getting past that hurdle of what does this actually look like when it's put into use, and how would this change who's representing us in office. What I will say is, when I look around Eugene, I have seen a lot of yard signs in favor of star voting. And the
Good.
other thing that's important to note is that, there are organizations, many voter advocacy groups, that did come out against this proposal. So the Tribal Democracy Project, Next Up Oregon, that sort of thing. But they organized relatively late in this process, announcing their opposition in March.
Right.
And, star voting advocates have been literally out there on the street advocating for this since at least last summer. And, looking back at the history of other attempts to implement this project for many, many years longer.
I got you. We'll get to that. What happened a couple of years ago, I think about 6 years ago now in Eugene, when we get back from our
Mhm.
break in just a moment. But Nathan, my last question for you. I learned from your reporting that if adopted, this new system won't go in effect until 2026. So 2 years from now, right? I found it interesting that ranked choice voting is also going to be on the ballot for Oregon state and federal elections this November. So does that present a potential conflict between the two systems down the line at all?
Right. So it doesn't present a literal conflict in that this attempt to adopt the system in Eugene would affect our local elections, so our city council, our mayor, our utility board. But when I speak to advocates of both star voting and ranked choice voting, they do say it would be confusing to have two systems introduced within relative proximity to voters that have been working with the same, winner takes all system, plurality voting that
Sure.
they've been working with for decades. So while it doesn't present a literal conflict, it certainly could be the source of a lot of confusion if both of these measures pass.
I guess we'll be following your reporting very closely, Nathan. I wanted to thank you again for your time and the work you do. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Yep. And listeners, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll have more on how this election system works, where it's been on the ballot before, and what the arguments for and against are headed into Eugene's vote on the 21st. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Hannah Nelson, the External Relations Manager at Ballotpedia. We're in the middle of our Ballotpedia Society membership campaign, and we'd love for you to join our generous BPS donors who have committed to making a monthly donation to Ballotpedia. By making a monthly gift, you'll help Ballotpedia provide daily, weekly, and monthly newsletters and podcasts just like this that are incisive, informative, and yes, free. There is no way we could keep Americans up to date with accurate and reliable information if it weren't for our BPS members. Will you join this group of Ballotpedia supporters today? Please visit donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024 to donate now. Thank you.
Welcome back to On the Ballot. I'm Frank Festa. I'm joined now by our very own Joe Greaney with more on star voting and Eugene's upcoming ballot measure vote. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Frank. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you as always. So before the break, Joe, Nathan brought us up to speed on star voting, the ballot measure out in Eugene, how it got on the ballot, so on and so forth. But I was kind of surprised to learn that in preparing for the story that star voting has only been on an American ballot proposal once before. And it just so happens that was in Lane County, which Eugene is part of. So bring us back to 2018, Joe. What happened with Lane County Measure 20-290?
Yeah, it failed on a pretty close vote, 52.4 to 47.6%, with just over 150,000 votes cast. I think that margin's pretty interesting. A lot of times when you see something on a ballot for the first time, it either gets blown out of the water or sort of adopted, not unanimously, but by a large margin. And that was a close vote.
Yeah, that's really close. I mean, only, what's that, 4 percentage points or so?
Yeah, just under 5 percentage points, yep.
Yeah, so Lane County, Eugene at least, again, is going to be re-upping this attempt in just a few days. And Nathan touched on it a little bit, Joe, but say more if you can about the argument for adopting star voting. Why do supporters think that it's a good idea?
Sure. Many of the arguments for star voting parallel arguments that we hear for other sort of alternative voting methods, ranked choice voting being the main one. Approval voting is another one that actually might be a bit more similar to star voting than RCV. But I think ranked choice voting at this point is a little bit more of a known commodity in the election reform, election policy space. So I think star voting most often draws comparisons to RCV. And I think proponents of star voting would compare and contrast that method to RCV in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that it's similar, or proponents of star voting argue that it's similar to proponents of RCV, is that they would argue it reduces polarization, makes campaigns more positive, it encourages candidates to appeal to all voters, and potentially reduces the impact of money in politics. I kind of go through some of those arguments and break them down a little bit.
Yeah.
I think on the idea that it would reduce polarization and encourage civility in campaigns, the idea here is that all candidates are going to be on every voter's ballot, and that to make it to the final round in star voting, to be one of the highest ranked, highest scoring candidates in the terminology of star voting. You've got to be appealing to all voters. You can't be appealing to a small minority. You need some broad-based support to reach that final round or to be one of the final two candidates. On the idea that it reduces the impact of money in politics, again, proponents of star voting would say that oftentimes super PAC dollars or dark money flows to spoiler or third-party candidates with the intent of influencing a separate candidate, a preferred candidate who is not that third-party candidate. So the idea there is to boost a spoiler candidate and water down competition for a preferred candidate. Theoretically, that would not be possible in star voting. Any dollars spent to elevate a what would have been a third party or spoiler candidate in a first past the post system would just be elevating that candidate and increasing their score in a star voting system and increasing the likelihood that that candidate actually wins the election. I think money influences politics in elections in particular in a lot of other ways other than just boosting third party and spoiler candidates. I do think that's a bit of a limited argument, but it is an interesting one. Another argument that proponents of star voting would make is that it helps avoid wasted or spoiled votes.
Okay.
And I think we can break that down into, or maybe look at both terms there. I think wasted votes would be something that proponents of star voting would say are more frequent in typical first past the vote or choose one election, such as the typical elections in the United States for legislative elections, both at the state level and for Congress. The idea there is that if you are voting for a third party or a sort of spoiler candidate, that ultimately, if that candidate does not win or does not have a large vote share, then they're not actually having the impact on the election, and any vote for that candidate is in essence wasted. It's not going towards any of the eventual winners or any of the actual finalists for an election. And then spoiled votes is more of a term associated with ranked choice voting. And the idea there is that if your preferred candidates in a ranked choice voting system don't make it past the first, second, third, they don't make it towards those final rounds, and you don't have any of those final candidates ranked highly on your ballot, then your ballot becomes spoiled, which means that your vote is not counted towards or against any of the final candidates in that election. And just some other similarities, again, that star voting has to RCV and sort of some of the similar arguments that proponents would make for each are that it levels the playing field. It puts all candidates from all parties on one ballot. And it gives voters the option to assess and make a determination on those candidates grouped together. And star voting proponents would sort of differentiate. Some people might say that a top two primary system, for example, does the same thing. Proponents of star voting would say that there is a fundamental difference there in that you still have just one vote or you're just choosing one candidate, even in a top two primary system. And then just some ways that star voting might be differentiated from RCV is that proponents of star voting would argue that it is an easier to understand system than ranked choice voting is. You're just tallying up scores. There's not really rounds of tabulation such as there are in ranked choice voting systems, which is oftentimes what confuses voters, or it's argued that confuses voters, that you get into a fifth or sixth round of voting and a voter who cast one ballot gets confused or doesn't quite understand the impact of what ranking candidates actually means for the outcome of an election. And then tabulation is another big one. Proponents of star voting argue that tabulation is much simpler and does not require centralization for tabulation that RCV requires. And I think really the arguments for star voting boil down to two essential points. And those are that it encourages honesty and disincentivizes strategic voting. The idea there is that you don't have to plan your vote. You don't have to not vote for your preferred candidate because you think that vote would end up being wasted. You can go vote for your preferred candidate, and then you can be honest about how you feel about every other candidate, and try and truthfully give them a score on your ballot, and that will really reflect your true preferences. And you don't have to sort of think about hiding preferences or how your vote's going to interact with other groups of voters' votes. You're just putting down what you really feel on the ballot.
Sure, yeah, that's a great summary of all the arguments. And there's so many different angles that people can approach things from,
Yeah,
So
and I don't even think I came close to summarizing all the arguments. I tried to hit some of the strong points there, but I'm sure strong proponents of star voting would add a lot to what I just laid out too.
Sure, yeah, no, definitely. But we got to fit in a summary, So I appreciate the brevity there. But bring us to the other side then, Joe. What are the arguments against the election system? Is it mostly, a resistance to change? Because I believe this is a relatively new idea. Or maybe is it more of an outright objection to the purported benefits, or maybe a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both for sure. And I think your first question to me illustrates that point. Star voting has only been voted on by a jurisdiction in the United States once before, and that's going on 6 years now. But that's a very short time span in the grand arc of electoral politics and reforms in this country as well. So yeah, it's definitely a new idea. And I think we're still going to see development around the arguments for and against ranked choice voting. But there's definitely, to your point, I think there's definitely resistance to any sort of change to how elections work. And that comes from a couple of different sources as well. That comes from the voters themselves, who might be used to casting their ballot in a certain way and aren't really interested in making any sort of changes to a process that they're familiar with and that they feel and believe works. And then I think there are other sort of more fundamental arguments against star voting as well. That are linked to the idea or resistance to changing electoral systems. I think a big one that folks who argue against the adoption of RCV would also apply to star voting is that it violates the tenet of one person, one vote, which many hold to be an important part of democratic politics, small d democratic politics. And I just have to caveat that by saying proponents of star voting and as proponents of RCV argue would say that it actually does not violate that tenet, that you are casting one vote, just that your one vote is on more than one candidate.
Sure.
But I think there are some nuances and some niceties to that argument that we probably don't have time to get into here. So.
Well, I was going to ask too, it is a new thing. I know it was only tested out once before in the same county that it's on the ballot again. And now is there a broader movement for star voting around the country, or is this maybe one of those more isolated instances where, certain groups are hoping to put it into practice and develop it in some place like Oregon?
Yeah, the short answer is not really. There's not really a sort of broad-based, widespread push for star voting right now. That said, I don't think that means that there won't be at any point, and I think there's a broader push for star voting now than there has been at any other time in the history of the United States. So, short answer, no. This is mainly focused in Oregon at the moment. One other jurisdiction, to my knowledge, has considered adopting star voting, and that was Redondo Beach, California. And then there are some sort of local support chapters, organizations in different parts of the country, in different states. But it's pretty hard to gauge the level of support right now. And I think it's probably easiest to focus on where the issue's actually been on the ballot, or where it's actually been considered by a governing body of a jurisdiction. And yeah, right now it really is limited to Oregon, again, with the Redondo Beach example in California as well. And then just one other point, Frank, that I missed on your last question about arguments against adopting star voting. I think a common one that we hear about RCV, that you also hear about star voting, is just voter confusion, that it is not necessarily straightforward to a voter. It makes most sense to voters to vote for who they want to see elected to that office and do nothing else on their ballot. And the idea of a scoring system or ranked tabulation again is not a thing in star voting, but It's just something that's something in RCV that detractors say confuses voters. Same thing in star voting. The idea that you're scoring candidates and how those scores are eventually going to be used is not necessarily intuitive or easily understandable to, especially to first-time voters. So yeah, voter confusion is another argument against.
No, that makes perfect sense. And I was going to ask, again, as we've been beating this horse a little bit, it's been on the ballot. There's only the second time. For it to fail twice in the only two instances, hypothetically, where it had been put forth, would that be a pretty big blow to the movement? Or, again, since it's kind of in its infancy, is it something that, will regather strength and maybe we'll see it on another ballot again soon, or maybe spread across the country? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could go both ways here. I think if it fails in Eugene in this upcoming election, it's not the death knell for star voting. I think we'll continue to see efforts to get star voting on local ballot measures to sort of spread awareness of the idea. And I don't think that if it is not adopted in this instance, it's done and we're not going to hear about it anymore. I think ranked choice voting again is an interesting comparison there. It took ranked choice voting over 150 years really to get to the point where we're at now, which is sort of the most widespread adoption that we've seen in this country. And that involved a couple peaks and valleys along the way as well. I wouldn't be surprised if something similar happens with star voting, where despite a potential electoral defeat, we'll still see it pop up in different places. I would argue, though, that if it does fail in Eugene, that proponents of star voting should maybe consider adoption in a different jurisdiction. The jury might be out on whether or not voters in Lane County and Eugene will adopt the measure on a third go. So I would encourage them to try elsewhere. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be the end of it one way or another.
I got you. Well, Joe, thank you as always for bringing this up to speed, man. Really appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll have you back on the show again soon.
Thanks, Frank. Always a pleasure.
Yep. And for our listeners, again, thank you for tuning in. You can learn more about our coverage and star voting at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festin, and thank you again for listening and watching. We'll see you next week.